The importance of education for healthy lives cannot be overstated. It is simply the most important factor in all of the research that we've conducted, and the aging brain is certainly no exception.
From the USC Leonard Davis School of Gerontology, this is Lessons in Lifespan Health, a podcast about the science and scientists improving how we live and age. I'm Professor George Shannon, Kevin Shue Chair in Gerontology. On today's episode, how Professor Jennifer Ailshire is expanding our understanding of the ways in which where we live can impact how we age. Jennifer Ailshire is an Associate Professor of Gerontology, Sociology, and Spatial Sciences, and Assistant Dean of International Programs and Global Initiatives at the USC Leonard Davis School. She recently spoke to us about her research into the role of air pollution on health and aging in a global context. Hi, Jennifer. Good to see you.
Hi, George.
Location, location, location. This is a refrain we often hear in the context of real estate, but it seems to play a significant part in how we age. What is the role of place in aging?
Well, I think of place as one of the greatest supports and constraints on the way that we want to live our lives. So we envision a life for ourselves, our daily decisions, but it's really dependent on where we live. So, for instance, I have a goal to be a very physically fit person and to engage in physical activity every day, because I know that's one of the best ways to support my own health and aging. But if I live in a place where there aren't a lot of opportunities for me to exercise outdoors, maybe because I don't have access to good park space or other recreational spaces, maybe because of weather problems, it's going to have a constraining power on my individual choices. So a lot of people really want to eat healthy and exercise. And some people live in places that provide a lot of opportunity for that. And other people live in places where actualizing those wishes, those goals is really quite difficult. And I became interested in this topic when I moved from Phoenix, Arizona to Ann Arbor, Michigan for my PhD training. Because Phoenix, Arizona is a car city, big car culture. You drive everywhere. You can't walk anywhere. Everything is too far away and it's quite hot in the summer. And when I was driving to and from the university or to and from work, there were any number of fast food joints I could stop at on the way to school or on the way to work. It was very convenient for me. When I moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, it was the first time in my life I had the opportunity to get out of the car and walk. And I used to walk a half mile to campus every day from where I lived. And there were no fast food options on my route. There were two really excellent markets. And my behavior changed completely just from moving to one location to another. Not only was I getting more physical activity, obviously, but I don't think I ate any fast food in that first semester in graduate school because I just didn't have access to it. Instead, I had access to kind of a nice little farmer's market and a grocery store by my house. And so that really got me interested in the role of place in our lives. And then, of course, there are other factors about environments that really matter in terms of social stressors like crime or feeling safe in your neighborhood, and also more physical characteristics like air pollution, which is one of the things that I've spent a lot of time studying while at the School of Gerontology here at USC.
Well, John F. Kennedy famously said, "We all breathe the same air." But it seems that this is not exactly the case. Why are certain groups more negatively exposed to and impacted by poor air quality?
We think of air as a physical characteristic. It's something that exists in the physical environment. But actually, maybe it's because I've been trained as a sociologist. I think of air pollution as a social phenomenon because, after all, it's produced by humans for the most part. And so air pollution is located in places where we have a lot of industrial activity and where there's a lot of car traffic. So some people live in areas where they're closer to those sources of air pollution. And it usually is the case that those are lower income communities because throughout much of our kind of industrialized history in this country, people who could afford to live in a nicer area that was further away from sources of pollution would move, and they would end up in cleaner air environment. Now, here in Los Angeles, we have poor air quality in a lot of places. on average, LA has worse air quality than a lot of cities in the rest of the United States. But there's also pockets of poor air quality here as well. So by the ports of Los Angeles and the ports of Long Beach, for instance, they have much worse air quality because a lot of that shipping and trucking activity, moving goods around. But living in California these days, particularly during fire season, means that a lot of us are going to be exposed to poor air quality at some point during the year. At that point, it doesn't really matter what our own socioeconomic resources are. It's really just which way the wind blows and where the fires pop up around us.
You've written about the unequal burden of air pollution and how it impacts older adults. Can you talk about that?
So when I started working on the topic, I worked with my colleague, Chuck Finch, who organized a multidisciplinary group of scholars across the university who ranged from chemical scientists to demographers like myself and covered the full life course. And I was one of the only people in the group who studied the later end of the life course, older adults. And at that point, there really hadn't been a lot of attention to the negative impacts of air pollution on older adults. Most of the research had been conducted in younger populations, in children and adolescents and in younger adults. But just in the past 10 years, it's become really clear that older adults are a vulnerable population and that they're more likely to suffer adverse consequences from chronic exposure to air pollution and also from these acute episodes. So we've done a lot of work trying to grow that area of research in public health air pollution topics. And I think that it has really caught on, and there are a lot more people who have been working in this area trying to understand negative impacts of air pollution on older adults. Our group was most interested in the aging brain, and so most of my research has been in trying to understand how air pollution might impact cognitive aging, increasing risk of cognitive decline or risk of cognitive impairment or the onset of dementia, for instance.
What role does education play in mitigating any of the harmful impacts of air pollution?
The importance of education for healthy lives cannot be overstated. It is simply the most important factor in all of the research that we've conducted, and the aging brain is certainly no exception. But actually, we think education is particularly important for the brain because we think what happens is that in early life, people develop a cognitive reserve, or some people call it a resilience, that essentially we're building capacity in the brain to be able to deal with insults that might occur later in life. So for instance, something like building up brain volume or neural connections in early life, which can happen in part through education, is really important when an individual gets older and they have exposure to toxic chemicals, for instance, that might cross the blood-brain barrier or enter the brain through other means. That having that underlying reserve or that ability to deal with these external threats to brain health is really important. And people with higher levels of education seem to have a little bit more of that capacity. The other important thing about education, though, is that it really sets people up for a lifetime of cognitive engagement. So people who have higher levels of education tend to engage in daily activities that are more likely to operate almost like a brain exercise. But it could be something as simple as playing instruments, speaking other languages, learning new things, taking classes later in life, and socializing with people. But anything that kind of keeps you sharp and keeps you on your feet is another good way to cope with the realities of some of the things that we're exposed to that might otherwise weaken the health of our brain.
Are there any federal or local policies that address the adverse impact of air pollution on older adults?
I would say that until recently, although people understood that older adults were a vulnerable population, there wasn't necessarily a lot of direct attention on older adults themselves. So those of us who work in this area of air pollution and its impact on health among older adults have been saying for a number of years that the federal regulatory standards that are used to regulate air quality, which have been really successful actually at improving our air quality over the past few decades since these regulations were codified and put into action at state and local levels. They tend to be driven by empirical evidence over the entire life course. They don't necessarily focus on the evidence for older adults specifically. And the problem that we've seen with that is that we tend to find that there are adverse health impacts at lower levels of pollution for older adults than there are for younger adults. So if they set a standard at, I'll just give a number, 15, which is a standard for some air pollutant, for instance, but the research has found that among older adults, they experience adverse health events from 12 to 15. Then setting the standard at 15 helps at kind of a population-wide level, but it doesn't necessarily help older adults specifically. And as older adults become a larger and larger share of the total population, it is increasingly important that we focus specifically on research that has been done in older adults to try to understand if some of our local and federal efforts need to be modified a bit to take into account the higher vulnerability in this portion of the population.
So what can we do? What more do you think needs to be done in this area?
I'd like to see a greater role of gerontologists on these EPA review panels that review the state of the evidence. Like I said, the research has primarily been focused on children and adolescents and younger adults, and it hasn't been something that has intersected as much with people who study older adults. So I think that we need to have a louder voice as gerontologists, geriatricians, people who are focused on the other end of the life course, that we need to have more of a voice at the table when these conversations are occurring about how we should be improving air quality. And I think that the EPA and state and local organizations are really receptive to this idea because they also see the need for it and the importance of it. I've already noted in federal documents that they've been highlighting the need to focus more on older adults, but of course they need that expertise kind of among their ranks. So I'd like to see more partnerships between the environmental sciences side and the policymaker and programming side with gerontologists who are focused on this population.
So collaboration, the idea of bringing scientists together from many disciplines is really important. What do gerontologists garner the kind of respect that can render their input impactful in these conversations?
Certainly, I think, as I said, as the portion of the population is increasingly older, in just a handful of years here, every baby boomer will be 65 years or older, which means they're going to start experiencing increased risks of cognitive decline. 20% of the adult population will soon be 65 and older. The role of gerontologists in conversations that maybe previously weren't as focused on aging will be essential. And it's really been rewarding for me to be in a school of gerontology because this is a place where these conversations and these multidisciplinary collaborations happen organically. They're effortless. So as I said, I ended up in a big kind of consortium working group focused on air pollution in the brain because my colleague, who was a biologist, organized it with some other folks on campus. And for me, it was a really rewarding opportunity to see all those different perspectives and learn from my colleagues across campus. I also think it's totally unique and wouldn't have happened had I been at any other university.
You've had the opportunity to expand your horizons. You're the school's first assistant dean of international programs and global initiatives. What trends or issues do you hope to address in this new position?
So this position resulted from multiple conversations I've had with Dean Cohen recently about what we consider to be the global importance of the School of Gerontology and what we see as our impact globally through not only our research activities, but our graduates. We attract students into our training programs from all over the world. And when they complete their training, they end up all over the world doing really incredible things. And often they're one of the only people in their area, in their job, their industry, their career, who has expertise in aging. And so they're making really valuable contributions. We wanted to do a bit more to highlight this amazing work that's being done by our faculty and the graduates of the school. But we also know that aging is the next major global challenge. It's up there with all of the other big challenges of our time. And so we really want to encourage more of a global perspective on the importance of gerontological research and training to help us meet these challenges that we are now in the midst of.
So your perspective is that global aging is really important and it's something that's going to be even more meaningful over time. You've been teaching a course looking at aging in Colombia. Are there factors that make it particularly compelling in that region to understand issues around aging?
I think if you ask most people, if you think of a place where there's aging happening or there's a large population of older adults, where are those places? And they would say, think of countries like Japan, the United States, the United Kingdom, some of the countries in Western Europe. But aging is happening everywhere, even in lower and middle income countries like Colombia that we didn't previously think of in terms of being an aging country. But Colombia, like a lot of countries in Latin America and other countries around the world, is experiencing a couple of key demographic changes, like falling fertility rates and increased lifespans. And it's all happening very quickly. So Colombia will experience the same amount of aging in their population in about 20 years that the United States went through in, 50 plus years, and some countries in Europe did in over a 100-year period. So this is a really opportune time to look at these countries that are undergoing this rapid transition to help us better understand aging. So we have this opportunity to understand aging in a lower income context. This allows us to see what aspects of aging are normal and which are maybe just typical. So a lot of what we think we know about aging, we have ascribed to be kind of like, quote, normal aging, or this is just things that happen with aging. But I see even in the United States with baby boomers redefining almost everything we've ever known about aging, it's become clear to me that a lot of what we think of as normal aging is probably not normal aging. It just is typical of the cohorts that are going through the aging process when we're doing our research. So Colombia is a completely different context, and we can see if we observe similar types of aging outcomes in the United States as we do in Colombia, that might be evidence that that particular thing is something more like normal aging. But things that we might find really different, like the rate of cognitive aging or risk factors for disease and disability in older adults, is completely different in a country like Colombia, then that tells me that it's not really a normal aspect of aging, and it's dependent on context, things like the environment, for instance, and other important social and economic factors. I also think that there's a potential to use the unique context of Colombia to help us gain insights to help us understand aging in the United States population. So some of my colleagues in Colombia are working on a very sort of famous study of genetics and Alzheimer's disease. They are currently the home of one of the world's most important clinical trials of drugs and interventions for Alzheimer's disease at the moment. And it's because they have a cluster of people who are genetically predisposition to get Alzheimer's disease at a very young age in their 40s and 50s. And so it's created this real world laboratory to understand a disease that we've just really been struggling to get a handle on. The discoveries made in Colombia will have far-reaching impacts outside of that country into the United States and other countries around the world, because we're all sort of dealing with this impending challenge of an increased number of people in the population who will have some form of dementia in their lifetime.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your insights into global aging, because it obviously is something that is going to impact all of us over the next decades. Is there anything else that you can think of that's kind of on the horizon, particularly in the area of your research, that you'd like to talk to us about or like to add to the conversation?
So I've just recently started an NIA-funded study on neighborhood supports and stressors and their impacts on people with dementia and their caregivers. And this is really the culmination of my work on neighborhoods and health and aging, and also on dementia. And really, it's informed by my understanding as a demographer and social scientist that while it's important to try to find treatments for dementia, we do have a lot of people who will just have dementia, and we need to try to understand any aspects of their lives or their environments that we can intervene on to make sure that they have good quality of life, that we're supporting their well-being while they're living with dementia, and importantly, Dementia is a disease that afflicts an individual, but I think of it really as a family matter because people with dementia will rely heavily on their family to provide much needed care. So just as much as we need to focus on supporting people with dementia, we have to think about the well-being of their caregivers as well, which is a huge topic that we work on in the School of Gerontology, and we have the really excellent Caregiver Resource Center to provide resources to caregivers because we know that the family impacts of dementia are profound and that we need to be doing more to support the people who are providing care for these older adults as well.
When I'm teaching my class in sociology, one of the things that I constantly mention is that frequently the caregivers wind up sicker than the people that they're caring for that very reason, the stress, the fact that they have so much of a burden that they have to carry. So it's quite true, and it's really very, very helpful for you to discuss those insights and that idea of kind of defining and going into the neighborhood aspects of dementia and dementia care is really useful, I'm sure. Well, thank you very much, Jennifer. That's been really informative and given us a wonderful set of insights into global aging, the idea of differences that exist within and between countries in terms of the impact of air pollution, for example, among older adults and young people. So I think it's something that we really can learn a lot from. That wraps up this lesson in lifespan health. Thanks to Professor Jennifer Ailshire for her time and expertise, and to all of you for choosing to listen. Join us next time for another lesson in lifespan health, and please subscribe to our podcast at lifespanhealth.usc.edu. Lessons in Lifespan Health is supported by the Ney Center for Healthspan Science and Center for Lifespan Health.